Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. As you guys can see, we're just coming back. There were technical glitches, technical issues, but it seems that those technical issues were resolved. And so we are going to continue with our interview for this morning undeterred. The Washington Post, whatever issues that people have with the various news outlets, the Washington Post did an amazing bit of reporting in what has been known as the Afghan files or the Afghanistan files. Now, these were interviews or documents that they received basically from an interview set called Lessons Learned. It was not believed or not thought that the interviewer or the people who were speaking were going to be made public. And so these people are very frank in their assessment and criticism of our work in Afghanistan, our operations in Afghanistan. In one case, you have Doug Lute, three-star Army general who served as White House Afghan war czar during the Bush and Obama administrations, told interviewers in 2015, quote, "We were devoid of fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing, what are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking." He continues, "If the American public knew the magnitude of this dysfunction, 2,400 lives lost. And later on, who will say this war was in vain?" You have other situations where basically they would lie to the public consistently all throughout the 20 years that we've been in that country. And they knew they were lying, but they will basically tell the public things are moving along, we're progressing, we're making progress. And the honest reality of it, that wasn't true. It was dysfunctional. You had the situation where one Leon Panetta nearly gets killed by a suicide bomber, but still comes out and says everything is moving along. So news was made yesterday when Joe Biden basically put out, or the administration, that they are leaving by September 11th, 2021, and that the number is going to go down to zero. Now, this breaks the Taliban's May 1st deadline that was negotiated with Trump. Will the Taliban give Joe Biden a pass on this? To have a conversation, we're joined with one Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is a former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. Scott, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Is there anything you want to add, or is there anything you need to adjust in what I said? I just wanted to give a basic context, at the very least in the way that I understand it, to the audience before you and I begin the conversation.
No, I think you laid it out fairly well.
Okay. Do you believe, or is the Taliban going to give Biden a pass on this? Because by my calculus, as I look at this, there are two paths of thoughts, I guess, that I take on this. One, that, okay, we give Joe Biden the opportunity to go to September where we don't necessarily do anything too drastic, where we would draw in or kind of push, incentivize Americans to stay more engaged in the area. Meaning, on some level, you have to respond to the fact that they're breaking the May 1st deadline. But does the response be to such a degree that it prevents the U.S. from actually leaving? Or do you take the perspective that Joe Biden is lying, Joe Biden is looking for just a reason to stay into the country, in which case you open up all hell on May 1st when they break that deadline? How are they thinking about this? Or can you give us a context in the way that this may be framed by their side on this? And for that matter, what is Joe Biden even thinking? Is he really talking about leaving, or is he just looking for an excuse to stay?
Well, the important thing here to realize is that the Biden administration's announcements regarding troop withdrawal from Afghanistan is not linked to any conditions-based outcome, and this is the most important aspect. previously, the United States had said, we will withdraw, and then would list caveats. One of the caveats was we're going to retain a permanent presence of U.S. Special Operations Forces in country or in the region who will be able to respond rapidly to any situation inside Afghanistan. That's no longer the case. There will be no U.S. troops there. People, they said, we're going to wait for, the Afghan government and the Taliban to come up with an acceptable, future governing structure. No, we don't care about that anymore either. We linked it to women's rights. No, we don't care about that. We linked it to, Al Qaeda and the Islamic State and the Taliban's guarantees that it would never work with them again. Nope, we don't link to that. And the point what I'm trying to make is it doesn't matter what the Taliban does. The Taliban today could declare all-out war and begin a frontal assault against every American installation in Afghanistan. We would defend ourselves, but we're still getting out. There is nothing that holds us here. And this was a conclusion reached by the Biden administration, that basically said if we attach conditions to the U.S. withdrawal, we will never withdraw because the conditions will never be met. It's the closest thing to an outright acknowledgement that the U.S. cannot win this war, will not win this war ever, that the Biden administration can make. We're leaving Afghanistan. It doesn't matter what the Taliban does. Now, the Taliban would be smart enough to recognize this. First of all, even if Biden wanted to leave Afghanistan by May 1st, NATO isn't going to. There's 7,000 NATO troops. And NATO has made it clear that, they're just not going to, when Trump was saying we're going to have everybody pull out, NATO was saying, no, we need to have a structure to this. There, and NATO was putting all these conditions on, the departure of NATO forces. If the Taliban is smart, they'll recognize that the United States has now got NATO saying we're going to leave by September 11th, 2021 as well, with no condition. They said the same thing. The other thing people need to realize is that the organization calling the shots in Afghanistan is not the Department of Defense of the United States military. It's the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA has its own private army in Afghanistan that operates independent of what the military and what the Afghan government want. And the CIA has said, that it not only wants to enlarge its presence in Afghanistan, but that it can't do this unless there's an American military quick reaction force, standing by to come to assistance with, close air support, intelligence support, medevac support. That's not going to be there. The CIA is getting out. Everybody's getting out. And if the Taliban were smart, they'd realize they've won. They've won everything. They got what they want. They'd recognize that the United States has all but acknowledged that it doesn't care what happens to the Afghan government afterwards, that the Taliban can come in and do anything it wants to do. It doesn't matter. We're out of Afghanistan, period.
Well, and this comes after in just the last couple of days. Again, the peace talks had been halted for months at this point. In the past couple of days, the Taliban had said that they wouldn't respond to any peace deal until American forces withdrew. They've doubled down on that in the last day in response to this most recent declaration by the Biden administration. They also said that they wouldn't adopt Western forms of government, whether those be communism or democracy, which is, of course, what the Department of Defense and under Biden and under Trump, what the U.S. government had been pushing for in the country. The Taliban has flatly rejected that. And yet peace talks will continue with the next round set for April 24th, just about a week and a half from now, which those seem like a formality at this point. Those seem like a mere continuation of the previous trajectory. They're not going to accomplish anything because, after all, if, as you're saying, if the Taliban is smart, and I'm sure they definitely have some members who are, they will see they have effectively won this one. They will simply continue their power in the region. Interestingly enough, I want to comment, Jamarl, you were talking about the Washington Post. They were good on the Afghan files, but if you go and look at their coverage today, it is either largely critical. Most of the articles that I saw on their front page were critical of the withdrawal, or the top one talking about how this is Biden showing that he is repositioning, basically pivoting from the Middle East to future and present confrontations with China and Russia, which is very worrying to me. In other words, we just were involved in a 20-year war that we're now close to ending. We left that country, in a deep state of political instability, and we were hoisted by our own petard by strengthening the Taliban when, of course, we came in originally to fight them. So our foreign policy goals, we didn't accomplish any of them, as far as I can tell, other than opium and other than sort of throwing our weight around to demonstrate, failingly again, that we are a military power. And I say failingly because, of course, we didn't win this war; we just fought it. It's turning for a second to China and Russia. It seems to me, Scott, and I want to turn to you because you have, military experience. You have experience reviewing the military's use of arms and reviewing what the military does in these cases. It seems like we've, over the last couple of decades, and you could even put this further back to Vietnam, but specifically over the last 2-3 decades, we have increasingly only fought insurgency wars. We fought either with proxy forces against insurgent forces or alongside insurgent forces in the case of, for instance, Syria, against governments. In other words, we're no longer used to all-out war, which is what it seems we would inevitably get into if within the next couple of years or the next decade or two, we were to get into a pitted war with China or Russia. What did we learn from Afghanistan? What have we learned from these wars? Have we learned, specifically militarily, anything that would help the United States in a war with a major country? How did this affect military policy, Scott?
Well, this is a great question. It's one that, I've reflected on. I will say this. I was part of the U.S. military back when we were solely focused on fighting and winning a ground war in Europe. We had a combined arms combat capability that was unmatched by any army or any military in the world. To give you an example, we had upwards of 300,000 American forces stationed in Germany, West Germany, and we had the ability to reinforce those 300,000 with 250,000 additional troops within 10 days. And we exercised this every year, or sometimes twice a year, in ongoing training exercises called Reforger, the return of forces to Germany. We were trained and equipped to do this. I, as a Marine, was trained. We embraced the notion of maneuver warfare, on how to bring to bear, ground forces, air forces, and maneuver in a combined arms activity to defeat an enemy. And the proof that we were doing this right came in 1991 when we went up against Iraq. We crushed them. It wasn't even close. And a lot of people say, well, of course, you're the United States. You're supposed to crush Iraq. Really? Several thousand miles away from our own shores, going from 0 to 750,000 troops in a period of several months, waging, a massive maneuver on the flank that was logistically impossible for any other military in the world to do, but we pulled it off flawlessly. Why? Because that's what we trained to do. And it cost us a lot of money to have that kind of military. And it required us, in order to execute that operation, we had to train constantly for this fight. At the end of the Cold War in 1991, we started to cut down our military. But the proof that we still had an effective combined arms fighting force came in 2003, when we drove from Kuwait to Baghdad in a very short period of time using a very small number of troops compared to the Gulf War. We still knew how to fight a conventional combined arms conflict in a masterful way that nobody could match. Then 9/11 came. 9/11 came before that invasion, but that military that we invaded Iraq with was the last time the United States possessed a military force capable of standing toe-to-toe with a peer or near-peer equivalent. From that point on, the United States became focused on fighting the insurgencies you spoke of. And these insurgencies became all-encompassing because to fight a low-intensity conflict for 2 decades, which is what we did, requires a complete refocusing and retailoring and restructuring of the military, not only in terms of the people on the ground doing the fighting, but every aspect of activity that supports that effort, from recruiting and training. I mean,
Scott, we've got to close, but it seems like you're saying, it seems like we've left ourselves stranded in terms of the kind of warfare that the United States chooses to engage in. And I'm guessing that we're going to see a resumption of those kinds of military exercises, but that'll be, that is itself a kind of threat as we prepare for a potential war with China and or Russia. Scott, we've got to close. I want to thank you again for joining us to talk about this. Great conversation so far. A short one, but a good one.
Well, thanks for having me.
And for those listening, that was Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with our next guest, Dr. Mikhail Kogan, talking about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine being put on pause by the CDC and the FDA over the potential of blood clots. We'll be getting into those claims, whether there is some truth to them, a level of severity potentially imposed by this vaccine. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking vaccines. After yesterday, the two chief public health and medicines regulatory agencies, those are the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, called for a pause on the use of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine over claims that it may cause blood clots. Now, 6.8 million doses of this vaccine have so far been administered in the United States, and of those 6.8 million doses, at least to the public's awareness, what's being reported is that 6 cases of blood clots have been disclosed. One of those women has died. They've all been women. One has died. Another is reportedly in serious condition. And they all started to experience blood clotting within the couple of weeks following their Johnson & Johnson shot. Now, Johnson & Johnson is a one-shot vaccine that is unlike the other vaccines here available in the United States, unlike the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, also unlike the AstraZeneca vaccine, which over in the EU has recently been seriously restricted, with its use restricted to people over the ages of 60, 65, over 50 in many different forms in different countries in the EU, also on the suspicion that it may cause blood clots. And apparently at a much higher rate, about 1 in 250,000 people who took it developed blood clots compared to the less than 1 in a million chance, at least based on the current statistics here in the United States for the Johnson & Johnson shot. But nevertheless, to join us for this conversation, to look at the facts available to us and to determine why exactly it's getting paused, because in my opinion, there just isn't enough to go on at this point. We're joined by Dr. Mikhail Kogan. He's the medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and the founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Dr. Kogan, thank you for joining us this morning, and I want to get right into it. Less than a 1 in a million chance. That is not just very rare. for a side effect, that is extremely, extremely rare. You could administer it to every person in the United States, and you'd have what is that? About 300 deaths, something like that. Which, no death is a good death, but that's a lot of cancellation and pausing over not that much actual risk. But Dr. Kogan, what do you think? What do you think I'm missing here?
It's a bit more complicated than that, right? So I think number-wise, you're absolutely correct. And we'll get into the details as to why this happens and what's the pathophysiology of the process. But I think part of the problem is, of course, there's a very heightened awareness of and just general fear of vaccines. There's several subpopulation of U.S. That have pretty low rates of accepting vaccine. For example, evangelicals, less than 50% are willing to accept the vaccine. So you can imagine that something like this will only increase the risk of people refusing vaccinations, citing, conspiracy theories and just saying, look, I don't want to take any risk whatsoever, be it 1 in a million, 1 in whatever. And, you can't really blame the public. I think there's been general distrust, of course. And, and also if you think about this, if the Pfizer and Moderna are not causing any of these problems, and so far there hasn't been any formally proven deaths associated in America with either of those vaccines, so why would you risk it if you have alternative? You can think of it that way too.
I hear you, but here's the thing. Like you're saying, it seems like there is a substantial part of the population who, for better and for worse reasons, don't like vaccines simply. And they certainly don't like, and these are, the mRNA vaccines have not been officially approved by the FDA. They've received emergency use authorizations, which basically it's not an approval. It's just we're in an emergency. So yes, use them. But isn't this adding fuel to the fire? I mean, and it seems with both AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, both of which, AstraZeneca, 1 in 250,000, that is another extremely rare. Less rare than this one, but still an extremely rare symptom. It seems like this would have follow-on effects. It seems like it would have a sort of contagious effect, not to use a misplaced pun, on people's impressions about the other vaccines. Mm-hmm. How do you think about that, Dr. Kogan?
Yeah, let's spin it a little differently. So first of all, this is exceedingly unusual condition. So it's something called central venous sinus thrombosis, and it can either happen in the brain or in other, which is then would be called that, or in other places. And this type of a clot, the process, why it's so unusual is because it's in the settings of low platelets. Usually when the clotting occurs, it's in the setting of either normal platelets or even some kind of a abnormality like an increased platelet count or some kind of stickiness of the platelets that is known, whether it's genetic or what. And so we know that this is probably related not to the vaccine itself, but to the vector. So all of this so far mentioned vaccines, and also including the Russian Sputnik, they're using adenovirus carrier. And that carrier seemingly is what's potentially triggering this autoimmune reaction causing the clot.
I see. Wait, just so we're clear, because you're using a few terms. Vector. Now, vector is just the thing that carries the information to the cell, or like the base that they're using in order to put the information in. Is that what's going on?
Exactly. And the adenovirus as a vector is basically a common cold virus. So it's an inactivated form that shouldn't cause any reaction. But it turns out that in some people, it basically activates some kind of an immune response.
Interesting.
The concern here is not just in those rare events, but concern is also, are we going to see those events come up in frequency? And that could happen as we not only increasing number of injections, but also, at least in theory, as vaccines going to get changed. Right, so they're going to get adapted or adjusted to the new variants. And is there a risk that this chances of the severe complication going to go up? We don't know. So I think this is a situation where I'm in a complete agreement with FDA, and I think that if you have a vaccine that is now proven to cause rare but deadly side effects, I think it's not only should be paused, the question should it be given whatsoever at all.
Very interesting.
I want to compare this. We were talking the other day. I've been looking at base causes of death of various things, but specifically with blood clotting, simple birth control, hormonal birth control, the pill, to use a single word for it, it increases the incidence, increases the likelihood of a woman experiencing blood clots by something like 3 or 4 times. And yet that is commonly prescribed. It's one of the more commonly used medications in the United States and around the world. That seems far more deadly than this vaccine would be. And I understand go for it. What am I getting wrong there?
You're right. So the difference is almost nobody dies from this clots. There tend to be a small clots. They're very predictable. We know how to calculate woman's risk. So if she's a smoker or if she has existing clotting disorder, you wouldn't want to prescribe it. And it's exceedingly uncommon for somebody to die from this situation because it's a different process. So here you have type of a process that there's a very limited treatments for. The treatment must be administered not just in the hospital, but exclusively in an intensive care unit because of the complexity. And it's also not that easy to diagnose because the patients often present with a kind of an atypical, not your standard clotting problem. And so if the diagnosis is missed, chances of death are exceedingly high because this condition not treated will get worse and will get worse quickly.
Also, if there's one condition like this that's bizarre and strange, the problem and the concern is what else don't we know and what else are we seeing that is tethered to something similar? I mean, because basically
I agree with
a bizarre blood clot has formed. Okay, is there any other pathology that's taking place that we're just unaware of that is we're not seeing on the lower level? I get it. I think Shane's point, though, is that doesn't matter. Shane's point is even if we knew as a flat fact that X number was going to drop dead as a result of using it, it doesn't outweigh the number of people who are going to be benefited. Shane, I don't want to straw man your point, but is that indeed your point? It's a trolley issue.
I think there's part of it which is a trolley issue, the sort of philosophical moral quandary pitted to people to test their preferences. But that argument applies more, in my opinion, over in Europe with the AstraZeneca vaccine and in Australia and in other countries that have restricted the use of that vaccine to people over certain ages. In that, they just don't have as many options there. In that case, saying.
Let me interrupt you for a second.
Go for it.
Because the problem with this condition also, there are very good chances that we have not heard the whole story. This condition is not easy to diagnose. There's a very good likelihood that we're actually going to see the actual frequency way higher. Because what will happen, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is way newer compared to AstraZeneca in terms of number of doses applied. And so chances are we're going to see an increased number of these cases. And I think FDA, understanding how the AstraZeneca's process evolved, wanting to simply put the hold on and try to figure out, is this a number, 2 in a million or whatever it is real, or is it going to go up? And I think the other big concern here is obviously, do we know for fact that, when you don't know exactly what's causing the problem, you have no idea how to prevent it, right? So we know that it seems to be women between age of 20-some to 60. So it's a kind of a very, younger to middle-aged women who are mostly affected or so far been impacted by this. But are there other populations? There's just not enough knowledge. So I think.
But that seems to come along with the whole process almost necessarily. Again, none of these vaccines in the United States have been approved by the FDA, and the whole process was necessarily sped up because you have a worldwide pandemic. 563,000, I think, is the number of deaths in the United States alone as of this morning. That seems to go along with it. If we were to apply that same logic to the different vaccines, we wouldn't be using them yet. And I get this is a different case because you're seeing some people experiencing those symptoms. But for instance, taking the AstraZeneca vaccine, it's been used, I think, upwards of 30 million doses, maybe more closer to 40 at this point in the United Kingdom. It seems like they would be following up with those people if there were a rash of deaths happening all of a sudden, a spate of people dropping dead from this issue. They would be reporting that. They would be aware of it. And yet when she was asked about it, one of the heads of the regulatory agency responsible for this, again, put the number at, I think it was between a 1 in 200 to 250,000 chance that you're going to get the central venous sinus thrombosis like you're talking about, this rare condition. It seems like, I guess there are different ways of looking at this, but particularly with the AstraZeneca vaccine, In Europe, they do not have that many other options. And so just weighing it, again, coming back to the trolley problem, what's your take on that? Even just ethically looking at it as a medical professional, it seems to me that more people would die from not getting them than would from getting them.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. Here's why. I think if ethically speaking, you first have this do no harm rule, right? You can override it if you know that the therapy is saving lots of lives. But that would be true if you have no other treatment available. But we do. And basically in a situation when you have an alternative treatment and you can put resources into revving up production of alternative treatment, excuse me, to be honest with you, I would say that why are we taking any chances when we know that there is another vaccine that appears to be safer? Now, you can argue whether it's safer or not. I think that would be a fair argument. And you have to kind of look at this from that perspective. But, from the angle of pure benefit to harm ratio, if you have an alternative, suddenly that ratio is no longer the same as if you would not have an alternative.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Ethically,
in the case of Europe, I don't see them as having a serious alternative to AstraZeneca. Yeah. They've talked about now, coming out in the last day, they're ramping up the production of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, and they've talked about in the last day signing a multi-year extension of the contract, basically the European Union, to produce and procure and distribute and inject a lot more Pfizer BioNTech vaccines. And once they get that, I don't really care. That if that's safer, if that's free of the cloud of uncertainty and sort of looming threat of danger that comes with the AstraZeneca vaccine, that seems fine to me. But right now they are running a shortage. Jamarl, you were coming in there. I didn't want to cut you off. What's your take?
In that case, I agree. I mean, Europe may decide that it's worth continuing because the other alternative is not very good because there's not enough doses. In U.S., Johnson & Johnson has been late comer. We have way more doses of Pfizer and Moderna. And frankly, also with the debacle of what just happened in Baltimore plant, they had to pull all these doses. So you sort of you can arguably say, look, it's this unfortunate, nobody meant any of this. It's just a bunch of unexpected problems.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, medicine is messy, and this happens. And I think if you sort of have to decide what's the best of situation here, I think relying on Moderna and Pfizer more, and yes, I understand it's more complicated. You have to have 2 shots and all this, and then there is also concern that this is a new technology. But frankly, this new technology, we now had so many millions of doses that seem to be safer. You could also make an argument that, well, we now have a practical experience. Sure, they haven't been used before, but after all these millions of doses, this appears to be safe. So, okay.
Well, we have a population-full experiment. We have basically 300 million people being experimented on all at once. And I don't mean that in a horrible way. I just mean it in this kind of flat fact. This hasn't, this is approved for emergency use because we're in an emergency environment type setting. I was going to say, I agree with the final assessment. This notion that, look, if you have other options, you use the other options. There's no point in taking a risk if you don't have to take a risk, even if it's minute. But if you don't have other options, then that AstraZeneca vaccine all of a sudden becomes far more, I would say, viable. I would even go so far as to say necessary. One death out of hundreds of thousands, when you're going to have hundreds of thousands of deaths anyway if you don't use it. Well, one last question on this has to do with, what do you expect? My thought when they came out with this was, okay, maybe there's something else. Maybe they're not telling us something. And maybe, what they're hanging this notion of, okay, we need to pause this on that issue, which might be an issue, as you say, in real terms, but it just seems like it's insufficient for the way it's been talked about. And maybe there's something else just kind of hanging about behind the scenes that they haven't necessarily disclosed to the public yet because they, don't want to create a bad impression on all the vaccines. If it was something like that, what would that be? You alluded to that yourself. I think I mentioned it yesterday, but you alluded to it yourself here. What do you think that could be that would create that sort of, okay, we need to pause this, we need to stop this?
I don't know. There's something else behind it. Honestly, this condition is so obscure that I had to go back into my medical school textbook to try to tease out what this is and read online. It's not, I think that's part of the issue. When you have something so bizarre and deadly all of a sudden, I think it's more, at least in part, it's got to be a big political concern, right? Because no matter how few cases are, they're going to be put out on a display everywhere.
Right.
And, unfortunately, the anti-vaxxers movement is strong, and it doesn't take whole much to kind of fuel that and spin the angle off, and present only negative sides. And next thing you know, so I don't know. I'm not sure there's anything behind this story except what's in the face. Is it? I don't know. Time will show. But, my other concern here is, we don't know also the long-term complications of any of this vaccine. Are there something that's going to be delayed by months to years? We don't know. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a massive experiment in an unprecedented situation where experiment has to take place, because otherwise it's going to lose a lot more lives.
Right.
And the experiment is justified, I believe. But when you find a treatment that seemingly has quite a severe complication with the choices available, I think it's justifiable to at least say, wait a second, let's look deeper into this. Let's pause the vaccine. Yeah. I think it's a hard place. Imagine the leaders of regulatory mechanism trying to sort of look at this from all angles and saying, well, we got to react to this somehow. What do we tell to the public?
One interesting, we got to close here, but one interesting side of this is that both the J&J and the AstraZeneca shots, like you're saying, are adenovirus based. They are more like traditional vaccines than the mRNA ones, which hitherto, as far as I know, haven't caused these kinds of complications, aren't coming into the spotlight as a potential cause of serious injury, which the experiment seems to have worked. I don't know, and maybe history will prove me wrong.
I agree with you. We've talked about this before. My opinion has been that this new technology appears to be not only in a way much simpler, but it also could end up being safer. I mean, it's my gut feeling that this new technology is going to end up being safer because it's using a very different principle.
With potential applications, and I don't want to stand for it too much here, but with potential applications, like we've talked about it for malaria, for Parkinson's disease, other things. We've got to close this out. Dr. Kogan, fascinating conversation. Thank you for bringing your expertise to it. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Pleasure. See you soon.
See you soon. And for those listening, that was Dr. Mikhail Kogan, the medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and the founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. When we're back, we're taking your calls in the wrap segment for today's somewhat cut short show. 202-521-1320 is the number. Taking your calls on the other side of the short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back with like 5 minutes to spare. Most of our show was cut out today due to some electrical issues at the studio. But if you want to comment, we've got enough time for maybe one more call after the caller we have on the line. 202-521-1320 is the number. Let's go to Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you are on the line. What's on your mind?
I have two quick comments. First comment is that Free Julian Assange. Okay, Burkina Faso court charged former President Compaoré in the killing of Thomas Sankara and also a general. That's a good thing, you know. And also, my second comment is dealing with several reports coming out of Iraq news agency, which a military blog covered. Vanessa Belli had retweeted that Iraqi and Iranian media claims an attack on a secret Mossad base in Iraq resulting in the death of a number of Israeli forces.
Interesting.
But also Times of Israel is reporting that didn't happen because the governor of Kurdistan, the Kurdish governor is saying that didn't happen. But yet another tweet came out saying that, hey, you're going to show proof that it did happen. So it's kind of like, yeah, they did it, then no, they didn't do it. One of those things. So
weird story. I had not heard about this. Thanks for the tip. I want to be quick about this because we got another caller on the line. But real quick, with the first story that you were talking about, what country is this based in? What was talking about? Thomas Sakori, I believe, a general being killed, something like that.
No, Thomas Sakori. His name is Compaore, the ex-president of Burkina Faso. He's the ex-president that ruled Burkina Faso for almost 30 years. In 2015, they had charged him with the murder of
Burkina Faso. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. So but the guy, the ex-president, lives in Ivory Coast, and Ivory Coast don't want to give him up to the Burkina Faso. And the general that took part in the assassination, he's in prison now. So
okay, all right, thank you. I want to follow up on that. I just wanted to go up on the facts because I was having a hard time finding out what you were talking about. Tarif, thank you for the call. We've got Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, what's up, fellas? I'm glad you guys were able to get back on. I'm calling more so about the not just the recent police shooting, but just the police shootings in general. I think that we're way past time. They should be looking at like training, but I'm not saying that what they're doing wrong. I'm saying in the amount of training, because you're putting officers like in the direct line, and only training for like what, maybe 4 to 6 months. I think on average is the police training period before they're out on the streets as patrol officers. But they're in conditions in many cases where special forces, Rangers, and regular Army speaking as prior Army. You train special forces and Rangers train for a year to 2 years before they even get to go to a group just to sit around and wait to be able to take action, and still training. And regular Army, you have all your basic soldier training, your AIT and all this stuff, but then you still are constantly training while you're in. Whereas patrol officers, they get their basic officer training, then they hit the road and they train with the officers they're introduced to the public with. But how often do they pull their weapons realistically as a patrol officer outside of some event or when they have to requalify? So I think that there's a lot of let's say deviant behavior going on as well. But in some of these cases, I think it really does come down to training and then the caliber of people you're bringing in because of the money you're paying, and that's coming from someone who is not in support of the police when it comes to these shootings. You know what I'm saying? But
basically, they need to be trained more. They need to get more training. And part of what complicates this whole thing, and why the comment you're bringing is kind of on point in my opinion, is Kim Potter, when she pulled the gun instead of the taser, was doing a training session with people that she was bringing up to speed. And if that's the level of training that they were getting, and I don't want to make light of a death, I'm not going to do that. But if that's the level of training they were getting, that is not good training. It does not qualify them for that.
No, it does not.
So point taken on that. Jamarl, what do you think?
Well, her screaming taser, taser, taser. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, I guess that's how it is. Because, the first question was, why are all these people walking up to the car like this? And it explains it. Yeah, that wasn't a good training at all.
Dirty.
Yeah, not good.
Yeah, it does not qualify. We need to cut today's show short. We need to close it off. We'll be back tomorrow morning, folks. I want to thank everybody who stayed with us and came back for the close of today's show after some technical issues. Thank you, Engineer Andre, for working everything out in the studio. Seriously, thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. Thank you to our guests, including the one.
That is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another truncated show in the record books. Yeah, we had technical difficulties. We were in the middle of the show, and it just, apparently all the electricity or something went down. And after it came back up, I think it was like an hour later, we, at that point, only had 45 minutes left. What's weird about this, very bizarre, when we tried to do the pre-record yesterday, we could not get Nick on the line. We had trouble getting him on the phone. We had trouble getting his home line or landline. We had trouble with Skype when we were trying to do it on Skype. We could not get that interview. That interview started like 15, 20 minutes late because of technical difficulties. And then to come here today in the middle of Nick's thing and bam, hits again. Also, I wasn't sure if our engineer, his daughter apparently is ill. So I wasn't even sure if that was why we were down. I initially thought it was just me. And when I was like, wait a minute, I'm still online. All right, I'm still online. What the hell is going on? But we stuck with it. Perseverance. All right, I will see you guys in a few minutes. Great interview with Scott Ritter and great interview with Mikhail Kogan. I think Shane is ultimately right on that point. And I think Mikhail even agrees. I mean, if we're talking about Europe, where basically if what you have is the AstraZeneca vaccine, and you have 1 in 250,000 people that are injured from that vaccine, how many people do you have that are dying without it? And if that number is drastically higher, then you better get that vaccine. I think that just makes sense. Like, share, and subscribe.